of that woman is not a person. It's not some innocent person. Therefore, then it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's only whether I should have this tissue removed or not. You make it some benign type of tissue or something that it's like saying it's wrong to have my appendix removed. Why would you say that? And many would just view it this way. It's just a medical procedure. It's just a safe medical procedure, not understanding that which is being formed in them is life which comes from God and ought to be protected because we are made in the image and likeness of God. Let me give you a couple of things. One is what I called the PHI factor before, and I give you an article on this, and I don't want to get into it, but it is an attempt at a scientific approach to individualizing that fetus. Okay, so how do you know it's an individual and not just part of the mother? So if it's just part of the mother, like an appendix or like having cosmetic surgery, something removed or whatever, isn't that all that it is? So the PHI factor would be an attempt at a scientific approach to demonstrate why a fertilized egg develops in specifically the way that it does, that is differently than any other cells that are present. Okay, why does it develop that way? This is different from DNA. It's actually taking DNA one step further. And so on the second page, it'll say, deducing the PHI factor. How can we deduce the presence of the PHI factor? And PHI stands for physical human individuality. Why are we even talking about this? It's because what we're trying to say is that which is in the woman is not part of her, but is in addition to her. It's not like another organ or not some appendage. It is actually a separate human being, that she is the host now of this separate human being. How do we know that? Well, one approach is this PHI factor. And so how do we deduce this? Let's start with an adult human individual. Where did that adult come from? It came from a child. The child grew and developed and became an adult. Is that at all surprising or miraculous? No, because we all know that the physical factor that made the adult as an individual human was already present in the child. Everything present from day one. So the child possessed the PHI factor, and as a result, the child grew into an adult who also had the PHI factor. Where did the child come from? The child is what the baby grew into, and the baby grew into a human individual child because the physical human individuality factor needed by the child was already present in the baby. And the baby, being a human individual, grew into a child who was a human individual and who in turn grew into an adult human individual. Well, where did the baby come from? Well, the baby is what the fetus grew into. Is this surprising, miraculous? Not at all. The baby is the fetus, only a little more mature. The baby is an individual organism because the fetus is an individual organism. Note, by the way, we are talking about an individual organism in the biological sense of individual, not in the sense of person here. But the fetus exists as a biologically individual organism and develops as a biologically individual organism and eventually becomes the baby, and we all recognize as a biologically individual organism. Thus, by observation, we can deduce that the same PHI factor that was present in the baby was also present in the earlier fetus. Where then did the fetus come from? Did some of the mother's cells suddenly and spontaneously decide to quit developing as mere parts of her body and start developing as a biologically individual fetus? Of course not. The fetus came from the embryo, genetically distinct from the cells of the mother. Genetically coherent with each other, the cells in the embryo are busy developing the structures needed for a complete and healthy fetus. Why? Because the embryo possesses within itself that physical human individuality factor that tells it to grow and develop as a human individual. So the PHI factor is how. It's how the embryo knows it's not just a clump of cells, like a wart or a bundle of muscle fibers. Because of the PHI factor, the embryo knows that by the time it grows to be a fetus, it is going to have only those bodily resources that it prepared for itself while still an embryo. In other words, we observe that the zygote knows it needs to develop into an individual fetus, something we do not observe in random clumps of unrelated cells or in tumors or in individual organs within a larger individual. Therefore, we deduce that the zygote too possesses the PHI factor. The same reasoning works backwards from embryo to zygote, from zygote to fertilized egg, and each stage of physical development, the organism works hard to prepare the physiological structures that will be needed by the next stage, and we can deduce the presence of the PHI factor throughout the development of the individual by the very fact and so on. This process of individual development is unique to individual organisms. Cancer cells and isolated skin cells, for instance, never develop into individual human zygotes or embryos. And the sperm and the unfertilized egg never grow into any of these multicellular organisms at all. I think that's pretty good evidence for individuality. But here's another one. This idea of the separation between the mother and the fetus. So let's build off of this and talk about the idea of the immune system. So one is the PHI factor that basically tells us what we have is a separate human life, separate human organism, person, or whatever you want to say, but is in the process of developing individually. Again, you've taken away from the abortionist the idea to say that, or the female to say, well, it's just part of my body and I have the right to decide what I do with my body. But yes, now you have another organism there, another organism. So the question that arises in regards to the topic of beginning of human life, especially in relation to the issue of abortion, whether a fetus is simply a part of a mother's body and thus under her control, or if the fetus is a separate, distinct entity. So many people contend that the preborn baby is part of the mother's body, yet the fact is often overlooked that biologically the mother's own body views the fetus essentially as a foreigner. Okay, so citing one scholar that observes that because the fetus contains paternal as well as maternal genes, the mother's immune system attacks the fetus. And these attacks can even result in spontaneous abortion in a small percentage of the cases. But scientists can describe the immune system as discerning between self and non-self and attacking the latter. And through this conclusion, the assumption can be made that the fetus is not part of the mother's body, but a distinct being with its own genetic code. Now, the placenta acts as the barrier then. So why the placenta? Well, it acts as a barrier between the fetus and the mother, further attesting to the fact that these are two separate beings. So one report, speaks of a recent study conducted by Andrew Meller of the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, and his colleagues had determined that the cells of the placenta produce an enzyme, and this enzyme protects the fetus from the mother's attacks. So it's interesting. This isn't, like common knowledge all over the place, but you begin to see how God ordained through human physiology the development of an organism, and didn't sort of make procreation something that just used tissues that were already there that could then be differentiated into some other being somehow. But there's just this very unique way of human procreation that has resulted in the mother carrying a separate and complete, but in development, person. So what about the other side? Just close and with this, and there are tons of arguments here, but I tried to construct for the abortionist group, believe it or not, an argument that I thought would represent their position, just to show how untenable it is, how untenable the best argument that you could possibly make. That is to say, on the anti-abortion argument, or the evidence that supports it, like the PHI factor and the enzymes and all the things that we mentioned, if those things are true, then how much of the abortion argument becomes dismantled? So listen. So here's one argument, and I have a few, but this is 7 premises again, so it's fairly well developed and a conclusion. So premise 1, a woman has the natural moral right, or is free to do whatever she chooses with her body. So we make differentiations between natural rights, legal rights, things of this nature. But you say, well, the woman has a natural right. In other words, she's free. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. She's free to do whatever she chooses with her body. Now, when you look at that and you're saying, well, it's hard to disagree with that, where would you disagree? But the key, because of what we've just stated, is with her body, not some other organism's body, with her body. And so even if you're getting by that, you go to number 2 then in the argument, where the woman is free to select among an assortment of legal options pertaining to her body, providing her choices do not infringe upon the natural moral rights or freedoms and legal rights of others. So now you're saying, well, okay, if it's my body and I have the right to do anything I want with my body, are there any limitations to that? Is it truly just whatever? And so you narrow that with the second premise by assuming the argument is going to be, well, you just can't do anything. You can't do anything. You know, there's freedom and then there's responsibility. And so you narrow that then to saying a woman is free to select among an assortment of legal options pertaining to her body, providing her choices do not infringe upon the natural moral rights and legal rights of others. Assuming that what I do aligns with the law, then I do have rights, but those rights are guided by the law somewhat. I can't be free to act in an illegal way, because it presumes that the illegal act infringes upon the rights of somebody else. That's why we have the law. That's why we have the law. So if we all agree to abide by the law, then my rights are protected and your rights are protected. A third, health choices are among the assortment of legal options that pertain to a woman's body. 4, medical surgical abortion is a legal procedure available for a woman to choose regarding her physical health. So in fact, here is this right, it's legal, and she can freely choose it. 5, pregnancy is a female health issue when a fetus becomes part of or attached to a woman's body. So I like to make that distinction because, like a tumor to be excised, a fetus is often regarded as not a component of the woman's anatomy, but as an appendage attached to the body. And so we want to be careful that you say, okay, well, this is just an appendage, but is it? Is it? Because as we argue in the PHI factor, that there are certain capabilities of that tissue, of that make it an organism, that make it a developing organism. No other appendage is going to develop as a separate organism. 6, medical surgical abortion is the removal of conception material. So again, this is how a lot of the medical documentation, it is described in these terms. However, as we looked at the opening of the lecture, and we say day 1, day 2, week 3, month 1, very early on in that pregnancy, it becomes aware that you just can't call this conception material. This is a beating heart. What type of tissue just has this type of human function? So, and then 7, there is nothing wrong with a woman choosing to have a legal procedure. Therefore, abortion is a legal alternative to pregnancy. But the view assumes the position of having the basic human, natural, moral right of autonomy, that is, having independence and the ability to exercise free choice. Is this a blanket autonomy, or does responsibility for one's actions attach to freedom, as we said a moment ago? That is, responsibility for others involved. And many would argue that, right or wrong, the decision must rest with a woman, and also consequences for the decision. But with regard to a woman's right is implied notion of legality. So since 1973, Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton have been respectively the law of the land. Therefore, within the spectrum of autonomy is included the legal right to choose abortion if desired. However, this is a moral argument, not a legal argument. It's a moral argument which requires justification on moral grounds. And so as such, from the abortionist side, the best that they can propose on moral grounds shifts away from the fetus, away from the child here, and shifts to the procedure itself. Well, if it was risky and fraught with all types of health problems and things of this nature, then it would not be a moral good. It would just be risking one's life. But instead, since it's safe, then that notion of it being a safe procedure then takes the risk out of it, and certainly makes it no harm to myself or no harm to anyone else. So I find the abortion, this argument, just on its face, notwithstanding all the biblical texts and theological stuff, right? But that has no bearing. Of course it has bearing in terms of what God thinks. But it has no influence over people that don't recognize the authority of the Bible or don't believe in the existence of God. But when you demonstrate to them the individuality of that which is developing in the womb, as far as its chromosomal distinction, its PHI factor, its individuality based on the enzymes and in the placenta and things of this nature, and there's just a lot of material that just screams that's an individual. That's not just an appendage. It's not just another tissue. That I believe you can make a good case to help someone understand what's truly happening. I think ultimately, in the case of abortion, we have to recognize that there's a great mission field out there. And number one, to convince people about their own life, that they have value in the eyes of God, and they're objects of God's supreme love. Christ on the cross and his redemptive work on our behalf is coming into this world and paying for sins he didn't commit, places this high value. Redemption places such a high value. The blood of Christ places a high value on human life. And so the life of that one that's contemplating having an abortion also carries to the most early parts of development of that one that could be the object of abortion. So we're thinking of it in this way, how valuable that life is. But at any rate, it's just a little bit of conversation about a pretty big subject.